Hello there, it's Mrs. Scoville, and today we are starting a new unit. We're going to be learning all about something called ATP and energy. Again, it is a new unit. This is Unit 5. We have 3 learning objectives for today's lesson. The first is to explain where cellular energy comes from. The second is to explain how this ATP thing is used as the energy currency of the cell. And finally, to explain which molecules the body and the cell uses for short and long-term energy storage. So starting out today's lesson, we just need to kind of think about energy in life. As you know, in order to survive, you need energy. This is true of all living things. All of that energy that living things need ultimately is going to either come from the sun or food, and even food, that energy is coming from the sun. Plants are able to take energy directly from the sun to make their own food. Anything that falls into this category, it's usually plants, we call them a special name called an autotroph. Okay, auto meaning like automatic, similarly. They're going to be able to make their own food, and they do so from the sun. It's mostly plants, also some like photosynthetic bacteria. Animals like us, or that tiger right there, are going to be called not an autotroph, but a heterotroph. So we actually have to eat something in order to obtain food. We can't make it ourselves. So if you just sat in the sun, you're not actually going to make any food. You have to eat something. So there we're going to either eat plants or other organisms to get our energy, and that's true of all heterotrophs like that tiger. Energy in the cell, though, isn't just going to be light. So energy can come in the form of light. That is a form of energy. Heat also is a form of energy. You may not think of that. And electricity as well. But beyond this, energy can be stored in chemical compounds. So in our body, that's how we're going to actually use energy. It's going to be in chemical compounds. And probably the most important chemical compound for dealing with energy is going to be this, here it is, ATP. ATP is an abbreviation for a compound called adenosine triphosphate. So again, ATP, that's short for adenosine triphosphate. So you can kind of see the A, the T, and the P. Tri meaning 3, so we're going to see that in a second, why it's there. Okay, so ATP, so again, adenosine triphosphate, is going to be our usable energy that the cell will use. We can use this to store energy, but it's also going to be the way that we get energy. So in this ATP molecule, you can see that there are kind of 3 main parts or building blocks. The adenine, which is right here on the left, and if you recall, that's one of our DNA bases. So that's going to be attached to a 5-carbon ribose and 3 phosphate groups. So this whole molecule together forms the ATP, and this is going to be the basic energy source for the cell. One thing I do want to point out to you, in case you've noticed, adenine is not the same as adenosine in name. The adenine and ribose part together are called adenosine. So those 2 parts together, that's how they came up with the name adenosine. So you can almost see the os right there, adenosine, and that's going to be the adenine and ribose together. Again, it's triphosphate because there are 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. ATP is going to release energy when this bond between the last 2 phosphate groups is actually broken. When this is broken, this process is going to go through what's called a hydrolysis reaction, and that's just a specific type of reaction where one of the products or one of the things that is made is water. So again, the energy is actually released from this ATP molecule when this bond is broken. So there's a lot of energy in that bond, and when it's broken, that energy is released. After this happens, though, this is no longer ATP, because it only has 2 phosphates after that phosphate goes away. So we now would say this compound is actually adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, because there would only be 2 phosphates. So again, once that bond is broken, this phosphate will actually go away. It won't be there anymore. And that releases the energy. So that one goes away. So because ADP and ATP can kind of go back and forth, this is a way that the cell is actually able to store and release energy. So if there's a lot of energy, like after you eat, your body is able to store small amounts of energy just by adding another phosphate to ADP, because in that bond, again, you store energy. So because this doesn't really have all of the energy stored yet, ADP, sometimes people talk about it in terms of a battery. ADP is thought of as like the partially charged battery because it doesn't have all the energy stored, whereas ATP would be like a full battery because it has all of the energy stored in it. Because you can go back and forth doing this, that's again the way that you can store and release energy quickly. Because this process does need to happen very quickly, when you need energy, it needs to be on demand, and your body needs energy all of the time. There's going to be an enzyme called ATP synthase that helps facilitate this process of changing ADP into ATP. Remember, enzymes just help things to happen very quickly. So at this point, we're going to pause for just a second and watch a video.
Used by most organisms to transfer energy is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. An ATP has three parts: adenine, ribose, and phosphate groups. Adenine is one of the bases found in DNA and RNA. Ribose is a sugar molecule found in RNA. The adenine and ribose portion of the ATP molecule is called adenosine. The three phosphates linked to the ribose in a chain are called triphosphate. Adenosine, together with the three phosphate groups, is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Notice the wavy lines between the two outer phosphates. The wavy lines represent high-energy bonds. Breaking the first high-energy bond in ATP releases energy and a free phosphate. This energy is used to power cellular activities. Adenosine, with only two attached phosphate groups, is called adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. Energy from the breakdown of food is used to change the ADP to an ATP. The energy stored in ATP is transferred and released when needed to power cellular activities. This process may occur as many as 10 million times per second in some cells.
So you can see that process is continually happening. Okay, so getting back over to our notes now. In your notes, I've put this exact link, and you need to go to it, and it's just going to help you go over this just one more time. It is important that you go and do this link. It's going to help make things a little bit more clear with the enzymes. Okay, so if we just summarize the storage and releasing of energy, remember we store energy by adding that phosphate group to ADP to make it ATP. And again, you're storing energy in that third phosphate bond. You can convert it back from ATP into ADP just by breaking that bond, and that releases energy. So we store energy by adding a phosphate and storing it in that bond. We release energy, we get the energy out by breaking the phosphate off, and these can go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The only difference really is that third phosphate. Okay, so in terms of how much ATP is actually in the cell, this is important to talk about here. Cells actually don't have very much ATP overall. Even this is a super important molecule, and cells are continually using it. As you heard in the little video, it can be millions of times per minute, per second, even in some cells. And this is just going to be continually recycled, though. So they're going to only have a small amount of ATP, because ATP, as it turns out, actually is not a good way to store large amounts of energy, and especially not for long-term storage. So ATP is really great for storing energy for short periods of time. It's very quick. With that kind of turnover, millions per second, it would have to be a very rapid process. And this is going to be the case. Cells are just going to reuse. And you really don't have to have a lot of ATP, because you can continually regenerate ATP from the ADP, as we saw just by adding that phosphate, using energy from food. So foods like starches have a lot of carbohydrates and glucose, and those are going to be able to use to regenerate. So this is actually why we have to eat. You have to eat so you can regenerate your ATP from your ADP. Any excess energy that the cell has for long-term storage, and this is true for organisms as well, is going to be stored more in glucose, which is a sugar. We know that because that has OSE on the end, or as lipids. So lipids are fats. So our carbohydrates and our lipids are going to be much better options for long-term storage, and so that's what we're going to use for long-term storage. Again, ATP is really only good for short-term. but we can always regenerate it. So it's a great tool to use in the cell. As a reminder, glucose and lipids, we haven't seen their structures in a while. Remember, glucose, it was a 6-carbon, it's a sugar, again, with the OSE. And lipids were the things that had the polar head and the nonpolar tails, and they're really long. Just to root this in a little bit of importance, though, I've already said this is kind of keeping you alive, essentially, but we have to have these different energy strategies, both long and short term, not only to stay alive, but so that our bodies and cells can maintain homeostasis. So remember that homeostasis was that idea of keeping a stable internal environment, which is why when you go to take your temperature, you're looking for 98.6. Okay, that's a stable internal temperature. Energy also, the processes that ATP is going to be used for are also going to be processes that help us generate heat and to keep us warm. Finally, this one's very important. If you remember when we talked about enzymes were able to lower activation energy, which was the energy it took to get a reaction started. But even with an enzyme, you still need some energy input to get reaction started. So we're going to need energy in a lot of cases from ATP to get reaction started. And if we think about this graph with our enzyme, we earn energy back when the reaction is over. But in the meantime, we have to get it started somehow, and that's what ATP is going to be used for. So you can think of ATP as kind of the cell starter. It's going to start a lot of reactions, a lot of cellular processes that are absolutely necessary. So with that, we are at the end of today's lesson. You do need to write a complete summary in your notes and complete the practice.